My name is Sherry Finke, and I'm the Ministry Relations Officer for this church. Actually, this church in 4 states, so I'm excited to be with you here today. I wanted to at least get up and introduce myself so that you saw the face that goes with the name. And if you have questions moving forward, you can certainly reach out to me. I have my business cards with me. We're going to talk today. Everybody calls it different things. Planned giving is one term. And what is that? That is basically, what do I have and who do I want to get that? I have to make a plan for that, right? I prefer the term legacy giving because I think that's what we all want to do, is leave something, a lasting mark on whether it's our families or our church. Making sure that the missions and the ministries of this organization can go on for many generations. So that is what I'm going to offer. I'm going to turn it over to Stephen Kaiser. I am still fairly new with the foundation, so I'm going to let you have his expertise for the actual nuts and bolts of this, and I'm going to learn as we go along. How's that? Thank you.
Great, Sherry, and thank you. And yeah, Sherry's being humble. She is very new. She just started in July, so this is an opportunity for her to get to know you as well as learn from me. I, unfortunately, am not as new. I've been at the foundation since 2004, so have been doing this for quite a while and really relish the opportunity to get back to what the core business of the foundation is, which is to really talk with you about how you can be a faithful Presbyterian and a disciple of Christ as you move through the different stages of your life and your faith journey. So happy to be here, happy to talk with you about this and to find ways to make sure that we are providing the service that fits your individual need and support. As I mentioned earlier, Sherry and I have a host of colleagues back in Jeffersonville, Indiana, who are there to help us and assist us. Some of them are attorneys, some of them are certified gift planners, but most of them are just good Presbyterians with wonderful hearts who are there to assist in any way that is needed. So Sherry, as she said, is your main point of contact. She will be the one that you will turn to, and then Sherry will connect you with the appropriate folks at the home office and hopefully find exactly what you need. If we don't do it at the foundation, we will find someone who does it for you. So don't worry about whether or not the foundation does it or making a match yourself. Just contact Sherry, and she'll know, and she will help do that. Because really, that's what we're talking about, is we're going to talk about how we can help you as individual Presbyterians think about all that God has blessed you with over your lifetime. And there's a lot to that. It's not only a distribution of our treasure, it's also a distribution of our time, our talent, our values, our hopes, our dreams for the next generation. I always love coming to churches and getting to experience the youth that you all have in your church. I know most churches would love to have more youth, but one youth is wonderful, as well as 3 or 4, how many, because they are what is going to be charged with the next generation of stewardship, the next generation of generosity, the next generation of carrying the kingdom forward. And our job, as we shift that responsibility, is to make sure that they are equipped to do that. And again, that not only means financially, but that also means with values and our theology and our spirituality and the way that we lived our life here on earth is what we want to transfer down to them. I had the opportunity of working with one of the parishioners in my dad's former church. My dad is a faithful servant of the Lord. He served 3 different churches and several interim churches over 60 years in the denomination. And one of the churches that I grew up in, I got to go work with one of the families that I knew. And we were working on a trust, which we'll talk a little bit about in detail later. But we were working on a trust, and she and her husband had both created trust and named each other as trustees on the trust, which is a wonderful thing to do. But by the time the husband had passed, they didn't get around to actually putting in the meat and the the values portion of the trust. The trust was basically just the distribution of their finances. So after the fact, we got the opportunity to draft a wonderful faith statement that she was able to share with the church to talk about what would happen with the result of the trust that they had identified. Fortunately or unfortunately, they did it in such a way that each trust went into the other trust, so we had some time, even though we didn't get to do that before he had passed. We did get to do it before she passed, so the church knew exactly what was needed and what was expected of them as the beneficiary of that trust. And it was a beautiful document. It stated all of the experiences that they had had together in their family in the church. It had mentioned the wonderful people who had an influence in their lives. It shared their hopes and dreams for the church moving forward, as well as sharing what they hoped that the money would support. And it was just a wonderful way for them to not only transfer wealth, but to leave a values statement, that leave that lasting legacy of faith to the church. And it also helped the church in two ways. One, it helped the church to really carry on that legacy by fully understanding what Ken and Mary Lou wanted to accomplish in that trust. But it also gave them an opportunity to praise it and show gratitude and to raise it up as a shining example for what others were to do. Sherry and I did something similar like this in Wheaton last weekend, and we went to the service, and during their youth time, the children got up and said, sang the song, Let This Little Light Shine. We've all heard that, right? But what a wonderful way to segue into some of the legacy conversations, because that's really what we're talking about. We're really talking about being that example, right, for the next generation and letting our light shine, not in such a way that it shines on us, but in such a way that it shines on God and it shines on all that He has done for us during our lifetime. And that's extremely important. This isn't about just doing something in secrecy, doing something in private. It's really about sharing. It's about being connected. It's about sharing those values and transferring those from generation to generation. So when we think about our legacy, we always want to think about it in that way. We don't want to just think about it from the financial aspect, although we're going to talk a little bit about that. But we want to talk about it in holistic approach, in talking about our values, our faith journey, the significance that our life led as a Christian was different than folks maybe who didn't live their life as a Christian, and how important that is for the next generation to understand and hear. As Reverend King said, please ask questions. Are there any questions about that? Are there anybody that would like to maybe share their experience with this? I know we have some folks in the room who probably have already made a plan, and we're talking about maybe changing that plan. Is there anybody that would like to share or talk? No is okay too, by the way. Okay. And I know that some of you have made a plan, because we are very, very above the curve when it comes to being Presbyterians. The number of people in the greater world, at least in the United States world, that have a will or a plan is about 53%. Presbyterians are about 64%. So if I did the math and did 64% of those present, there would be a few of us who have already made a plan. So what we're really talking about is, are there other things that are around plan giving, estate planning, that you could maybe incorporate into your plans already that might be helpful? Because I did mention in my words during worship that there are tax advantages to doing this. It's not the reason we do it, but it could be a benefit where it could maximize the opportunity to have more dollars for mission or for ministry or for our legacy. So it is important to think about these things from a numbers standpoint to make sure that we're maximizing where we want those dollars to go. So thinking about these and maybe thinking about the plan you already have and thinking about ways we can tweak that or change that might be helpful. So the other statistic that I'll throw out, just because I think it's helpful to kind of understand the context, is if 64% of us have a plan, that plan was usually first drafted when We are at the average age of 47 years old, which is good. But as you can imagine, that's probably for reasons of other things other than financial. It's probably for taking care of our kids, might be some health care issues, might be some special needs, those types of things. That's not the extremely important statistic. The extremely important statistic is we change our plans less than one time after it's been established. So if we are writing an estate plan at the average age of 47, and we aren't changing that anytime during the rest of our life, or maybe just one time, we are probably missing out on opportunities and things that are going in our life that could be beneficial in our estate plan. So I tell you that to make sure that you think about this as a living, breathing document and a plan. You don't do what my wife and I did. I'll confess, I'm 58. I wrote my estate plan basically in the form of a will when I had my first child, which was unbelievably 29 years ago. That document has not been looked at, and my youngest is now 25. So I need to go back and revisit that, because what those children needed when I first drafted it is not what they need now that they're 25, 27, and 29, right? So I need to do that, and that's full confession. I am guilty. So I will go do that at some point in time. But there are lots of life situations that we need to think about that we need to adapt our plan to, okay? Great. So what I'd like to do now is really shift into a few nuts and bolts about an estate plan. The real things that kind of make this move from a financial standpoint, and how can we really leave a lasting legacy of faith through the resources that God has provided us over our life here on earth. What I provided you, and for those of you folks who are at home, I'm sure there will be plenty of these available that Sherry and I will leave to make sure that you can get at your convenience. There's also a packet that the church put together. And let me first define the difference between the packet the church put together and the information that I handed out to you. The packet that the church put together is specifically tied to an endowment. An endowment is wonderful, as I mentioned. The endowment primarily is the vehicle or the receptacle, the fund, the bucket, whatever you want to call it, for receiving legacy gifts that then can be managed in perpetuity to benefit the church, okay? And we'll talk a little bit about that. So the document the church put together really talks about that and the internal structure and how valuable that can be to you. But what I provided you is probably ancillary to that and talks about other vehicles like trust, which I've already mentioned, donor-advised funds, real estate, stocks, your IRAs, and those things which we'll talk in specific about. So they go hand in hand. They're parallel, but they are a little different from that standpoint, okay? So an endowment fund is the internal structure that the benefiting organization would put in place, or the donor would put in place for the benefiting organization, that would define how we're going to use the money moving forward. So an endowment, when you use that term, means that we're going to take money and put it into a fund. We're going to invest that in such a manner that it generates annual income, and we're going to define what that annual income is used. And the intent is that we never touch any of the gifts that go in it, which means it's always there, which hopefully if we invest it correctly, it's growing over time to keep up with inflation, and it's providing that steady stream of income to the benefiting organization, in this case, the Presbyterian Church of Palatine, to make sure that we are doing mission. And that mission can be defined, or that mission can be very general, because the needs of the church will change over time as well. But it's just a nice internal structure that will ensure that mission will be funded today, tomorrow, 20 years, 75 years, 100 years. I know this because the Presbyterian Foundation was charged with managing the first permanent endowment fund to the denomination back in 1815. A generous Presbyterian by the name of Elias Boudinot, who is also a founding father of this great country and a signer of the Declaration of Independence, used his estate in Philadelphia to create this fund to buy Bibles and books for seminarians and churches who couldn't afford it, and the church established the Presbyterian Foundation to do that. And we are still doing that today. So 213 years later, we are doing that. We are still managing that fund. It works because we now have 7,300 funds like that provide ongoing annual income for ministries and missions within the PCUSA. Okay? It's a powerful tool. It's a wonderful way to provide some stability and some freedom from the benefiting organization to know that they're going to have some reliable income to support their ministries and mission. Donors can do that like Elias. Churches can do that to set up that infrastructure to receive it. The nice thing about Elias's gift is not only did he give to it, but others can give to it in the future. And it continues to grow through gifts and through the investments at the foundation, okay? And I would encourage you to think about that. It's a wonderful way to do that. One of the things that comes up many a times in our opportunities to engage with congregations like this is that we have folks who have been faithful stewards in our pews for 35, 40 years, as you have experienced, and they go on to a better place, as we all hope to, and there is a void that is left because over 35 years, 40 years, they've become very faithful and they've become very generous in their giving. And if that is something that's missing from the church because they're no longer around to do it, that can put a burden on churches. And one of the concepts that some churches have engaged in is something called endowing your pledge, which means that you, through your estate, would leave a certain amount of money to a fiduciary like the foundation or some other entity to manage this endowment that would then generate enough money to cover your pledge, even though you're not here to make that pledge. A lot of times churches or donors will do that for a period of time. And then after that 20 years, let's say we'll endow our pledge for 20 years with the hope that the church would have others who come behind you to fill that void. Then that money would then go to some other cause or something like that. But it's a wonderful way to utilize a vehicle to ensure that the church is going to be able to fund a mission today, tomorrow, and into the future. Make sense? Are there any questions about that? Does anybody have any experience with an endowment fund? Or you can just raise your hand if you do. I won't make you talk, I promise. Okay. If not, I would consider, have you think about that and consider it. It's a good way to do it. A lot of times in churches, too, we'll have someone who likes to start the endowment fund for the church that then others in the future can give to, and that's a really nice way to create that infrastructure within the church through your generosity and through your legacy. And what a lovely legacy to teach others, right, about giving in perpetuity by creating that. So think about that. So that's kind of the endowments and really the crux of what planned giving is. But now we're going to talk about some of the other pieces that are in this brochure, this Composing a Legacy. And as Sherry said, we named it Composing a Legacy on purpose. It's not called planned giving vehicles. It's not called Given Death. It's not called, anything else. It's called Composing a Legacy for a reason, because that's really what we're talking about, is what is your legacy going to look like, and how can you use these tools to make that? So the first tool I want to emphasize is the first one that's in here after you get past all the power of attorney and all the healthcare proxies and things that are part of your plan. Those are important, but that's really outside the scope of Sherry's and my responsibility. That's for other attorneys and nurses and doctors to help you with those things, families as well. And I would encourage you to think about all of that with the appropriate experts, as well as include the experts you would want for tax advice and all of that to draft your plan. But the first one we're going to talk about is a bequest. Does anybody know what a bequest is? Okay. A few of you. Do either one of you want to be brave enough to kind of? No. Okay. I will explain what it is real quick, and I'm sure they will agree with this. The bequest is the part of your will that says we are going to distribute a certain amount to a not-for-profit organization like this church. There are other sections that distribute it to your children, to distribute to other things, but the bequest is how am I going to leave money to my church in this instance. It can be very simple. It can be one line. It can be I leave 10%, that's a tithe that comes to my head. And if you run into my father, please tell him that I said tithe, because he's a pastor of 60 years and that's important to him. So I did say it, Dad, tithe. 10% is a tithe. You could leave 10% to Presbyterian Church of Palatine, Illinois. Now, that would probably work. And hopefully, since I believe there's only one Presbyterian Church of Palatine, hopefully that would be easy to distribute. But as most of you probably know or have some experience with, we have a lot of First Presbyterian churches in the denomination. And if I were just to write, I leave 10% to First Presbyterian Church, that's going to cause some problems because they won't know what First Presbyterian Church and all of that, as you can understand. So I would encourage you to maybe put in a little more detail in your bequest. Make sure you put in the address of the church. Make sure you put in maybe the tax ID number, those kind of identifiers so it doesn't get confused by the person that has to do that, usually the executor. If there's no executor, then the courts through probate get involved. And if there's a challenge or if there's some confusion, this can get tied up in the legal process instead of getting to what you want is to the church to do mission. So I encourage you to think about a little more detail than that and what you want. The bequest, the paragraph, would also be a wonderful place to include your statement of faith. Like I mentioned earlier with Ken and Mary Lou and their trusts, the bequest can also be a wonderful place to hold your thoughts, your wishes, your values, your desires for the next generation, and make that eloquent and part of that, and then distribute the money to the church, okay? And that's really the cornerstone of a good estate plan, a will and a bequest, and you could be done. The nice thing about that is it doesn't have to be changed very often. If you use a percentage, it can stay there as a percentage. If you leave it general enough that the church's changing priorities and landscape would be addressed, you've pretty much accomplished what you want, and you can focus on the other pieces, your health care and all of that, power of attorney, and all of those things that need to be addressed, okay? Does that make sense to most folks? Pretty simple. So let's talk about some other things that can be helpful in that too that are outside the will. Since I've already mentioned the trust, let's talk about that. So there are guidelines in every state. We're in the state of Illinois, so they have guidelines on how they would discern who gets the money. I don't know if you all saw this article. I want to say USA Today. It was about 3 weeks ago. There was an article about a gentleman who left $100 million undesignated, unidentified to who it belongs to, and they had to go out and find out who all of his heirs were, and there were 117 different people who were connected to this gentleman across the world who had never met them, who are now going to get $70,000 each because the courts had to go figure this all out and stuff. It was really kind of an amazing story, but it did remind me how important it is, to make sure that we have those plans in place and that we're identifying the folks that we want to receive that. So the trust can be a wonderful way of doing that. So if the courts have a process for wills, if you don't have one, like this gentleman didn't, they would go figure it out, find all your family members and distribute it. And maybe that's okay. Maybe that's what that gentleman wanted. But maybe that's not. Maybe there are other things to include. I met with a wonderful Presbyterian on some church business, and afterwards she shared with me her family story real quickly that, her mom and dad were at the age, they were retired, they were doing their will, and they basically had named her and her 3 brothers and sisters as the beneficiaries of their will, named her as executor, let her read it, which is important, and it didn't say anything about the 6 churches and the 2 presbyteries that her dad had served. And when she talked to her dad about it, he just goes, well, I didn't even think about that. I just wanted to make sure you children were taken care of. And she said, Dad and Mom, that's wonderful, but you've done a great job with us. We probably will be okay. It's not that we wouldn't like the money or we wouldn't use it, but we don't necessarily need it. We think it would be helpful if you figured out a way to include those 6 churches and the 2 presbyteries in your estates. So what they did is they divided it by 5 instead of 4. And I think I heard during the service something about the church being a member of our family. And this really exemplified that in my mind. Like, what a wonderful statement of faith, right? To include those churches that they served and the presbyteries they served as a member of their family and evenly divided it by 5. Good way to do it, good way to think about it. But if you have it and do it through a will, if you don't have a will or don't have a plan, the state has a plan for you. If you want to remove it from that process, there are things called trusts that can be created that then have a different set of rules and guidelines that could be beneficial. Most of the time, the benefit of putting it into a trust is avoiding costs, expense, and tax ramifications. The tax structure for a trust can be different than a tax structure for a will or a normal probate situation. And for most of us, while we may be supportive of the value we get from our municipalities and our federal government, I think most of us would like to see that lessened and more of it go to the mission activities that we want to support instead of leaving it up to them. So that could be of value to you and could be something you want to do that. So if you take it out of the will or not having a plan and putting it in a trust, you are putting it into a system that is more managed, that has people looking over it, and can be advantageous when it comes to tax advantages. And primarily what that means is the vehicle that you're using to fund the trust will not take a hit on taxes or will reduce the tax load or will spread it out over the course of years, which allows the money to work more within that trust. You can also, within your trusts, create a life income stream for yourself or a beloved spouse or grandchildren that might be beneficial. A lot of times folks will have special needs within their families that they want to help take care of. Trust can be set up for that. It's wonderful. So just know that there is this vehicle called trusts, and they come in lots of shapes and sizes. Most of them are charitable remainder trusts, whether they're a unit trust or an annuity trust or something. But know that they can be set up to receive an asset, invest it over time, generate money to you individually, not the church at this time, that you can use while you need it. And then when you no longer need it or pass, then whatever's left in that trust can go to the church, okay? They're wonderful. There are other life income vehicles like gift annuities and pooled income funds that can also take advantage of that. Just think about that. One example is I had a church in Ohio that I was working with, and they were doing a capital campaign, and they went and talked to this couple whose husband, the male spouse, had been serving as the Boy Scout leader for 35 years, and they thought, wow, this would be great. We're going to upgrade the facility. Boy Scouts are going to get better room to do their, activities. We're going to give them equipment. Don would probably love to support that, which any good capital campaign consultant would tell you, find those links, right? And then go make the ask. Well, the pastor and the chair of the capital campaign committee went and talked to Don and Mary about this, and they got turned down. So the pastor started asking more questions from Don, and what he found out was Don had just been diagnosed with an illness that he was not going to have much longer, probably 9 months, 6 to 9 months, and he didn't want to give up a huge amount of assets to the capital campaign because he was worried about Mary and what she would do when he wasn't there. So we worked with him, and what we came up with a charitable annuity trust with some stock at a highly appreciated value, because stock has appreciation on it that gets taxed, that we put into a trust, and it was going to guarantee Mary $18,000 a year, which made Don happy because she needed that income to make sure she was taken care of. And then the church was nice and included that remainder trust in their capital campaign and all of that. So it was a win-win-win. But it was just a wonderful way to ensure life income for Mary if we're worried about our spouse's well-being or that. So remember that. We call those life income gifts. They are also in here. I'm not quite sure which page. I think it's either page 5 or 7 that talks about those. I think it's at the bottom of page 5 and maybe goes through 7. But those are extremely helpful and can be very valuable to you. Any questions or thoughts on that, or did I just speed right through that so fast that you're all left going, what did he just say? No? Cool. Again, the point is, remember, there are ways to use your assets to get life income and then make a gift as well. The other one I want to talk about is something that has become extremely popular in the giving world, and it's called a donor-advised fund. Has anybody ever heard of a donor-advised fund? No one has. Has anybody ever heard of Bill and Melinda Gates Everybody has. Well, back a few years ago, COVID changes my time. I don't remember how many years ago now that we have this little void of 2 years. But a few years back, Bill and Melinda Gates created a foundation and then challenged other generous, well-off people to help and to do some work across the globe on certain areas. I think global warming, I think technology advancements and all of that were included in that, and it became a multi-billion-dollar endeavor, okay? How many of you would like to be able to do that, give away $1 billion? I would. I think that would be awesome to have that ability. But if we don't have $1 billion, we can still set something up very similar to what Bill and Melinda did. It's not exactly the same because I'm sure at that dollar amount there were some criteria they wanted to make sure were in place. But through something called a donor-advised fund, you can create your own little foundation or charitable checking account or whatever you want to call it. And here's how it works. It's a donor-advised fund. You have a donor that creates a fund that names advisors who are going to distribute that money from the fund, okay? Very simple, very easy to do, and a wonderful way to take advantage of some tax implications. Here's an example I have for it. Again, in Ohio, I don't know why all my examples are in Ohio, but I cover Michigan and Ohio since 2004, so that's probably why. But in a church in Ohio, the financial secretary called me. Has anybody ever been a treasurer or secretary of finance for this church or some other entity? Okay, so you all are keeping track of the money and where it goes and in and out and all that stuff. It's an important job and very, sometimes can be complicated. Well, I got a call from a financial secretary, a treasurer at one of the churches in Ohio, and she said, I've got a unique situation, although I found out it wasn't that unique. She had an individual who needed to make a $30,000 contribution to get some credit against some gains she had had in another business, right? So if you have gains in a business, your adjusted gross income goes up, your tax may go up. She didn't want her taxes and other benefits to be affected, so she wanted to offset that $30,000 of gains by a $30,000 donation, hoping that that would net her zero, right? And it probably did. So she told the church she was going to give them $30,000 worth of this appreciated stock, but she didn't want the church to spend it right away. She wanted the church to spend it $2,000 a year for the next 15 years to count as her pledge. Now, as a financial secretary, that would be a little daunting because that's a lot of pressure, that's a lot of responsibility, and I may not be here 15 years from now, and how am I to ensure that the next person knows and all of that, right? And then how do I account for that? And all these things are going through this person's head. So what we did was we worked with one of our gift planners back in the home office. I think I mentioned that earlier. We have gift planners in the home office. And Pat came up with a wonderful plan with a donor-advised fund where she, the donor, could put the $30,000 in a donor-advised fund at the foundation. We would manage it per her selection. We have different selections you can choose for investments. She named herself as the advisor, and then she tells us every year to send $2,000 to that church. Church doesn't have to do anything except record a gift of $2,000 towards that person's pledge, which we do. That we know how to do. We can easily do that. She got her pledge meet. She got her tax deduction from the foundation instead of the church, which isn't a big deal. And it worked out really, really well. And if we did our job right when I set this up, she was going to get just over 17 years instead of 15 years at $2,000. Because again, remember I told you we'd invest it and we would hopefully grow it. And she would get more dollar or more bang for her buck, so to speak. So it was a wonderful way to do that. As the advisor, she could have changed that. That was one of the risks the church would have to take, but I think it was worth it. I don't think she changed it ever, but she did make additions to it, which you can do, and she did make other distributions to other entities from there as well. So again, it really becomes this nice little mechanism to make a gift today and then make a gift today and make distributions in the future, which could be helpful in lots of situations. Now, that's kind of the nuts and bolts of it. Here's the heart of it, and this is the story that I really like about donor-advised funds. I had a pastor friend of mine, this time it was in Michigan, not Ohio, and his dad had passed. His dad was a good colleague of my father, and I knew Jeff very well, and we were talking about church stuff again, and then we were eating, and Jeff just said, hey, Dad passed, and we have to distribute all this money. Part of it is that he gave each one of us $10,000 with the stipulation that we couldn't just put it into our economy and put it in our checkbook and pay for groceries and car bills and all that stuff. We had to give it away. Dad wanted us to kind of give it away and make decisions instead of Dad making it. I don't know if Dad was passing the buck or if he was trying to teach his kids how to be generous. Either way, Jeff was then all of a sudden given $10,000. And he didn't know what to do with it. He goes, Steve, look, I've been a pastor for 35 years. I've been giving generously. This isn't really something I have time for. I'm not really sure what to do. I said, well, Jeff, don't you have 3 daughters? He goes, yeah, I have 3 teenage daughters. I go, why don't you name them as advisors on this? Create a donor-advised fund, put the $10,000 in it, name those girls as advisors. Every year, they have to get together and decide what they're going to distribute. Because technically in a donor-advised fund, you're supposed to give 5% away. You could probably miss a few years. No one's going to say anything. But you're supposed to give 5%. So 5% of $10,000 would be $500. So those girls get together every year, and they decide how to give away $500. Well, what a wonderful way to leave a legacy. What a wonderful way to teach the next generation how to be generous. What a wonderful way for them to have to get along. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't. There were 3 of them, so I guess they could break the tie unless they all 3 wanted something different. But it's I thought, just a unique way to use a tool to help the next generation not only be generous, but also, to understand that whole legacy piece and what we want to do. And I'm hoping that the girls would then add to it and make that grow and continue that because they are now in college and on to other things. So a couple of ideas for donor-advised funds. They're wonderful. They're great ways to do it. We have a lot of them through the foundation. Our platform for doing it is all online. You don't have to do it online, but if you like to do things online, you can make additions, you can make requests, you can see what's going on in your donor advised fund, all online, real simple, real easy to do, okay? The last thing I'm going to talk about is something also that's become extremely common and extremely important for us to do in our plans, and that's distributions from our IRA. How many people have IRAs? Okay, I won't ask the next question, but when you get to a certain age, we have to make distributions from that, right? It's minimum required distributions, MRDs or QRDs or whatever you want to call them, qualified distributions. When you get to a certain age, as I said, you have to make a distribution. Sometimes it's beneficial to make your gifts directly from your IRA, which you can do, right? You can make a gift to the church from your IRA, which means it doesn't have to go from your IRA to your checkbook to the church. It can go directly from the IRA to the church, which means the IRS does not count that as income coming in, raises your adjusted gross income, and might change your benefits, right? Or your taxes, which can be helpful. And also, as it being a investment, it could be invested in things that have highly appreciated, which means you're taking something that you paid $1 for, and now you're making a gift of $2 on that dollar. So it can be beneficial as opposed to just writing a check out of cash out of your checkbook. Not saying it is. You would have to look at your own situation. Again, that's why tax advisors and people that help you with that are important to figure that stuff out. But think about that. It's a really good way to do that. And then how that fits into our plan giving conversation or endowments is you can easily name on death a beneficiary of your IRA. It's usually a form. You can go to your IRA provider and you can get the form, and then you can request who is ultimately going to get that. And again, in the same way that making a gift directly from your IRA in the year that you need to make, get a distribution, making a gift directly from your IRA to the church at death does not include that in your estate, okay? Which means, again, the tax situation may be different. If you get to a certain threshold with everything that you've accumulated and your estate gets to a certain amount, there is a tax event that happens. If you stay below that, the tax event is either minimal or doesn't exist. So you want to make sure you know what that threshold is. You want to make sure that you're not adding things in and that gets too high, and then making distributions. Because I'll tell you, the most simple way to do it would be just put everything in the estate and tell the estate to divide it up by 5, like we mentioned earlier. But again, sometimes that cannot be the most efficient way because you don't want to bring all those assets in, then the IRS counts that as a higher threshold and taxes you at a different level. So you want to think about all that. You want to think about what's the right way to make that gift. It could be through your IRA. It could be setting up a donor-advised fund. It could be creating a permanent endowment fund from your estate, which would then change that as well. There are just lots of things. This is the 30,000-foot view of all of that. Everything I mentioned should be here in some shape or form. There's some additional things. But the bottom line is, think about it. Talk to Sherry if you would like some help from the foundation. Talk to your attorney. Talk to your tax advisor. Talk to your family, because it matters. It matters how that works. It's not always normal for us to talk about that as a family. I know my mom and dad went and did my mom's 87, my dad's 89. They went a few years ago, had that all thing, and they shared it with my sister, my brother, and I, so we would know. It's a good thing. They've got this wonderful book for us that the attorney put together. It's got everything in it. It's great. It has incorporated some of these things as well, which is nice. The other thing is make sure you communicate it with the benefiting organizations that are going to receive something. The detail I'll leave up to you, and how you communicate that, I'll leave that up to you. Again, it's not to shine a light on what we're doing. It's just to ensure that our legacy is carried forward by the people we're charging to do that. So, let the church know that this is there, that they can, prepare to receive that and to think about that as well. So communication is extremely important in that. Those are the things I wanted to share. Again, I'd be more than happy to answer any questions now or later or from the folks online, and I see one hand, so perfect.
When the church makes the decision to open an endowment fund, is there a minimum investment for the additional investment that is required for the Presbyterian to open the endowment?
Yeah, so the question was, is there a minimum for the church to establish an endowment that then can receive other gifts in the future? It's a great question. It's a little complicated of an answer, and this is why. There's 2 answers to it. One, it depends on where you're doing the endowment. If you're doing the endowment at a third-party organization like the Presbyterian Foundation, there is a minimum. Our minimum is $25,000. If you're doing it in-house, which a lot of churches will do, they'll create the endowment structure and they'll use a mutual fund or something as the underlying investment vehicle, and they'll manage it themselves. I have lots of churches that do that, for good or for bad. If that's the case, then the church would set up what that minimum is. You could set up the infrastructure and count it as 0 and wait for that first gift to come in, and then do that because you own the investment account. But if you're looking for a third-person outside party like the foundation to do it, there probably would be a minimum to establish it. And there are pros and cons for that, right? Using a third-person outside organization like the foundation to manage your endowment means you all get to focus on using the money that comes from the endowment, which we think is a better use of time. But I also understand that churches have resources internally that they can utilize to do that themselves, and that may be appropriate. But that's it. Did I at least answer the question there? Next question, yeah? Sure.
You indicated that the endowment gifts, typically the principal gifts, are never taken back out of the endowment. In the event the church were to have a significant financial need, could the principal be withdrawn?
So that's a 2-pronged answer as well. If you do something called a true endowment, or as we call them at the foundation, a permanent endowment fund, whether you do that yourself or you do it at the foundation, using the word endowment pretty much implies, pretty much legally binds you to never touch the gifts, okay? Legally, the word endowment means I'm not going to touch any of the gifts or principal that comes into the fund. I'm only going to touch the annual income, okay? So if you put it in a structure like that, and there's a permanency part of it, organizations like the foundation will require you to name a contingent beneficiary, which means we're going to set this up to benefit this church in perpetuity. If this church ceases to exist or in our case, ceases to be part of PCUSA, then the money goes to something else. Our book of order in PCUSA says that that would probably go to the presbytery, which is the next governing body. But if you don't want that, then you can state in the contingency language what you want, okay? That would be a benefit of doing it yourself. If you did it yourself and you didn't use endowment language, then the session of this church would have the authority to use that money as they see fit. I would encourage you to make sure you are identifying the difference to people so they know before they give a gift whether it's permanent, whether it can be invaded, whether it can be touched, whether it can be used altogether, that kind of stuff. But if you're going to ever need the principal, you should probably refer to it as something other than an endowment fund, because an endowment fund really means I'm not going to touch the principal. Okay? You can call it a reserve fund, you can call it a memorial fund, you can call it a ministry fund, anything. Just try to avoid endowment language, because that would open the door for someone to come and challenge you if you used it and say, hey, that's an endowment fund, you're not supposed to use the principal, right? Was that clear? Thank you. Great questions, by the way. One more, go. Yeah.
Could the church create a donor advisor fund and accept gifts in that and create a committee to administer the fund?
That would be a wonderful idea, and we have talked about that and thought about that, but right now, legally, a donor-advised fund can only be established by individuals. They can't be established by entities, right? Oh, so folks on the screen, I'm sorry. He was asking if the church could establish a donor-advised fund, name a committee up to 5 people to be the advisors, and the answer is no. An organization can't do that. Only an individual donor can do that. Okay? So they could. So you could have the 5 individuals that you wanted to be advisors establish the donor-advised fund. But it would be their donor-advised fund, not the church's, but you could then just benefit the church. The question would be coming, once those 5 donors pass, donor-advised funds have a 20-year shelf life, which means it can only exist 20 years after the donor died. So then it has to be liquidated. So you could, it just would last only for 20 years after the last person, right? Very good questions. Thank you for those. Reverend King, did you have anything online? Anybody ask a question?
No, looks like you've done a great job. Nancy. Thank you so much.
You bet.
Being here, and thank you all for staying, and thank you all out there for staying. And again, I think this is something that we need to be in a conversation with for the future of our church. So thank you.
You bet. Great. Thank you.